Hello, everyone. This is Bill Gibbs. I'll be the host for the session today. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm looking forward today. We have a great presenter, and I'll be introducing Dr. Robinson in just a little bit. The session is being recorded, and let me go ahead and get the session started. We'll be talking about critical differences, challenges and differences between the private and public sectors. And if there's any topic whatsoever that is of interest today, it has to do with the whole area of the infrastructure that we all live with. And I'm looking forward to this presentation. Now, let's talk a little bit about the agenda that we'll be following today. We'll be together for just almost exactly an hour. We'll talk first a little bit about capital technology. While I recognize that many people in the session are faculty, staff, or alumni, we always have a handful of people that are brand new to the organization. So we'll talk briefly about capital. Then I'll have some housekeeping. I'll introduce the presenter, and that includes a brief conversation that we'll have with her before the presentation begins. Then the heart of the webinar, of course, is Dr. Nikki Robinson. We'll have time for questions, and then at the very end, we'll talk about our upcoming webinars through June and how to get a copy of the recording, slides, and certificate. Now, just a little tiny bit about capital. And again, I apologize for those of you who have been in other webinars and have seen these slides before, but there's always some that are new. We were established in 1927. So if you do the math, you realize that in this decade, we'll celebrate our 100th anniversary. Always into technology, always concerned. And it's no accident that technology is literally our middle name. We're the only private university in the state of Maryland that's really specifically dedicated to engineering, cyber, computer science, and tech management. We're nonprofit, private and accredited, physically located in Laurel, Maryland. We have regional accreditation, which in the United States is the highest level of accreditation available to any university. And we're also authorized by the state of Maryland to confer all of the degrees that we offer, all the way from our 2-year associate's degree right up to our doctoral degrees. The DBA, the Doctor of Science, and the PhD. And interestingly enough, our presenter today has 2 of those 3 doctoral degrees. I don't know if I'm planting a seed for her to work on her DBA or not, but a Doctor of Business, but nevertheless, we look forward to her presentation. Now, here's some housekeeping. We are not enabling audio today or video for the participants. If you have a question, just type it into the text chat, and we will take those questions. The presenter can take some as she goes if she wishes, or we'll bundle them all together at the end and answer all of them. We'll take just as many of the questions as we can. We'll type them into the text chat, or you will, but she will answer them verbally. As I mentioned, mics and webcams are not being activated for you for this session. We'll be sending a link to the recording. The session is being recorded, and we'll send a link to the slides to everybody who is registered for this session. So if for those who are here, welcome. If you've registered for the session, it turns out that you can't attend, we'll make sure you get a copy of the presentation. And then we'll offer a participation certificate to both live in-person session viewers and also on demand. And I'll talk more about that at the very end of the presentation. Our presentation today is Critical Challenges and Differences Between the Private and Public Sectors, presented by Dr. Nikki Robinson. And I'm going to introduce Dr. Robinson, but I want to make sure that I do it right. So give me a moment to find her bio and read it to you. Nikki Robinson is both a Doctor of Science and has a PhD. She's an adjunct professor at Capital Technology University, and as I mentioned, she holds 2 earned doctorates. The Doctor of Science degree is in cyber, and she has also a PhD that she just recently completed in human factors. She holds master's and bachelor's degrees in IT areas. She works in the cybersecurity and IT industry as a security architect for IBM, specializing in vulnerability management. Additionally, she teaches graduate level courses in quantitative methods, incident response, and healthcare mobile device security. She holds multiple industry certifications, including the CISSP, CEH, CNDA, NC, ITP, and CCAA. And to get all of those initials down, make sure and say them right, and make sure I do that right. Now, before we begin the presentation, we have some attendees who are still considering if IT or cyber is a career field for them, and also maybe just starting their educational journey. And so I wanted to take just a moment to interview Dr. Robinson very briefly and find out more about her academic and career journey so far. So Dr. Robinson, we'll start by asking a question. Tell us a little bit about your background, where you grew up, and how you first became interested in IT and cyber.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for having me. So I grew up in Southern Maryland, and I was very fortunate to have a dad who was very much into IT and engineering. He taught me a lot about mathematics. And so early on, playing video games, getting hands-on with a computer, that definitely led me to a career in IT.
Now, you actually have 2 doctoral degrees from Capital, including the one that you just received earlier this year, or maybe it was late last year. Tell us a little bit about those degrees. Typically, one doctorate is the work of an academic lifetime, and you have 2. So tell us about your interest in each of these separate degrees.
Yes, so for me, the DSC in cyber was a no-brainer. It was a very much a I was in IT operations at the time, and I started looking around at low and medium vulnerabilities and getting interested in vulnerability chaining and how those vulnerabilities could be used in combination. Spoiler alert, I'll probably be talking about vulnerability management a little bit today. But yeah, so I started doing research, and when I found the DSC in cybersecurity at Capital, to me, that was the degree I needed to get into cybersecurity. And while I was in the program, I actually made the transition from IT into security. And then when I finished, actually, as I was finishing the DSC, the PhD in human factors came out. And I was like, oh no, I'm so interested in this too. How am I going to do this? So I finished the DSC, and to continue the research that I did in cybersecurity with vulnerability scoring and chaining, I leveraged that into the PhD in human factors. And so I took a lot of the quantitative research that I did with the DSC and turned it into qualitative and understanding phenomenon with the PhD in human factors. And to me, the combination of the two was really, really impactful for really for my career in cyber.
That's wonderful. And I often joke, wonder if I should be calling you Doctor, but I don't think that
yeah,
sounds like a runny, funny joke. Okay, now our final question is, and then we'll get right into your presentation. What advice would you give to someone who is interested in a career in cyber?
My first piece of advice, I have 2 pieces of advice, but my first piece of advice is to research. There are so many domains within cybersecurity. I think, especially someone who's thinking about getting into the industry, there are a lot of different fields and specialties and domains within cybersecurity. So there is this really great mapping of all the domains within cybersecurity. I highly suggest looking at that first. I like the idea of sort of starting general, getting a good idea of what you like generally in cybersecurity, and then building into a specialty. So, make friends in cybersecurity, find a mentor, find someone who can guide you and give you advice. Obviously, I'm a little biased, but I think education is really important. But with that said, there's a lot of really great, when you're just getting started, sort of free resources to see what you like. So I highly recommend doing that, and finding a mentor, someone that can help guide you.
Thank you so much. Well, I don't want to take any more time on the interview. And now we're going to move to your presentation. Folks, if you'll bear with us a little bit, we're going to transition from my slide share, screen share, to hers. And so I'm going to stop sharing momentarily and then give her the opportunity to share her screen. So I think we have that set up already. So go ahead and pop it in there. There we go.
All right. Okay, well, thank you so much, Bill, for the introduction. Okay, so just a really nice light topic for a Thursday afternoon. We're going to be diving into some of the really big challenges, things that are going on between the private and public sectors, but really talking about critical infrastructure and what does that mean, to the private sector as well as the public sector. Quick disclaimer, all thoughts, feelings, views expressed in this presentation are my own. They do not reflect any of my employers. A lot of the work that I've been doing and researching these topics and working in these areas, I think it's so important to really get a chance to talk about these things, to raise awareness and to share some of the research and work that I've been doing on. So I went over this a little bit. Bill was kind enough to share a lot of my bio. One of the things that I've really been enjoying as far as the research angle is it really allows me to bring together a lot of the academic research work that's being done into my professional world. And so taking research methodologies, taking, academic literature and journals and things like that, and bringing that into the practical world has been really beneficial. So just a quick overview. I'm not going to go too far into the agenda because I want to get right into the meat of it, but I want to cover some of the different sectors. I didn't want to assume anybody is super familiar with all of them, so we're going to touch on them at least a little bit, as well as talking about some of the cyber attacks, of course, right now, what's going on with Ukraine. There is a lot of concern, specifically with critical infrastructure. So didn't even know how timely this presentation was going to be, but it's been updated with some information, as you'll see as we go along. Talking about some of the current challenges, and then, of course, closing with what can we do? What can we do, whether we're in the private sector or the public sector, to try to help protect our systems? So this is just a big swath. These are the different sectors within critical infrastructure. There are 16 different sectors. Each sector obviously has their own sort of responsibilities and their own infrastructure that comes along with it. Everything from emergency services, the IT sector, which is huge, water and wastewater systems that we're finding, especially in the last couple of years, are really critical to survival. I mean, to us as humans surviving. So it's been very interesting. Someone I've been in cybersecurity for about 4 or almost 5 years now, and having been on the IT side, it's very interesting to sort of look across these different sectors and see how, while each one has their own, they may have their own different types of attacks or their own responsibilities, that at the end of the day, there are a lot of things that we can do to sort of collaborate and seeing some similarities between the sectors. But the interesting thing that I wanted to bring up here is, as looking at all of these different sectors, and again, I'm not going to go through all of them, but we have everything from communications. When communications go down, how do we handle incidents? Without food and agriculture, what happens? What happens to the farmers and the farms and the food supplies that we rely on if something happens? So I think it's interesting that cybersecurity isn't just about securing systems or secure configuration or risk assessments. It's also about understanding what does that impact to human life, to our supply chain, to all of those other aspects. So it's really touching so many different areas in our world, across the world. We're not, we're talking internationally now. So to bring it back, I just wanted to highlight this here because I think when we talk about public sector versus private sector, there are, of course, different agencies that manage those different sectors, and they, are responsible for guidance and regulations, things like that. But then there's, you know, the private sector that are working with the public sector, or they may have their own systems that they're managing, you know, waste and water, energy, all of these different systems that, while they may be governed or regulated by, you know, a public sector body, that they still have their own systems that they have to manage. So there's this interesting, I think it's an interesting relationship to talk about, because there are so many partnerships, you know, and even bringing in academia into it. There's so many public sector and private sector relationships, especially when it comes to critical infrastructure. So it's not something that I know I always think about. And so I like to highlight here how there are some, you know, necessary partnerships, and then we start talking about third parties and what does that mean to those relationships as well. Okay, so I'm sure a lot of people, you know, especially the cyber industry, but I'm sure a lot of people, this was very, very big in the news, you know, the Colonial Pipeline. I wanted to talk about some of the different types of attacks and highlight how critical this is, how important this is, that we start to look at what does disruption look like for critical infrastructure. And with cybersecurity attacks, with ransomware, with DDoS, distributed denial of service attacks, depending on what types of attacks are occurring, it can have major repercussions and long-standing repercussions. You know, so not just, oh, we're out of power today, or oh, gas prices are higher today. It may be more of a long-standing sort of a trickle-down effect that happens, that things may change as time goes on. So Colonial Pipeline, ransomware. Ransomware is one of those things that in the last 5 to 10 years, it has really just become really accessible for malicious actors to use. It's easy to use. It's easy to buy now. There's ransomware as a service. It's easy to buy and use, which is very dangerous and scary, because if it happens with something like the Colonial Pipeline or the Florida water supply, JBS Foods, that was a ransomware as a service group. When these types of attacks happen, there are immediate sort of there are immediate factors, immediate things that happen to the people, whether it's, you know, in a specific town, like the Florida water supply, or it could again have farther reaching implications. You know, they may service one area, but what if one attack is successful and then the malicious actor thinks, well, we were able to target these people. I wonder if we can target another city. I wonder if we can target a state. I wonder if we can, you know, so it leads to all of these. If they can do this, what else can they do? And I wanted to mention just in 2021 that there were 600 specifically ICS vulnerabilities disclosed. I did not get into the metrics of how many critical, high, medium, mostly because, again, from a lot of the research that I do, just because a low vulnerability is scored as a low doesn't necessarily mean that it, you know, is not exploitable or that it could not be used in an attack. So I think it's just an important metric to note that there were 600 vulnerabilities disclosed. Those are only the ones that are disclosed. And as a doom and gloom cybersecurity person, I'm concerned about the unknown unknowns. So that's what we know about. What do we not know? And that's specifically critical infrastructure. You know, I'm not even talking about, you know, SaaS products and things like that. This is specifically ICS. And then currently, I highly suggest, I can post the reference in the chat, but there has been a really great, you know, joint effort by CISA, NSA, FBI. They post these great bulletins now, and one of them is about the Black Bite ransomware, specifically targeting critical infrastructure. So I highly recommend checking that out, and there's some other great open source information as well, but CISA has some great information on remediation. So how can you potentially mitigate, you know, these concerns with ransomware? So this is just, I want to highlight again, these are the known knowns. This is what we know about. This is what was disclosed. There were potentially other attacks that were stopped. There were other attacks that maybe didn't make the news. There were other attacks that were not disclosed at all. So it's important, I think, to note that this is just what we know about. We have to be concerned about what else is happening in the world, and and in the United States, across the United States. What else is going on that that we're not aware of right now? So to sort of take it back to differences between maybe types of attacks that happen between the private sector and the public sector. Again, this is all open source information, but there are going to be different types of attacks and attack paths used depending on what sector you're in, as well as, private versus public. In the private sector, there has been a lot of, I've been talking about and researching business email compromise, I think for like 5 years now. It's one of those things that I think doesn't get talked about enough, but it is a very effective type of attack. It's where basically an attacker will either spoof an email, or they will compromise an account of a CEO of a company, and they will effectively ask for a wire transfer to a foreign bank and get money transferred to that foreign bank, and they'll never see it again. But it's a highly sophisticated attack because the attackers will sit in someone's email account. If they've compromised the account, they will use basically behavioral analysis techniques to understand their target, how they write emails, how do they send a signature? Do they send it from their iPhone? Do they send it from their laptop? Do they, what's the makeup of the emails? How often do they request wire transfers? So they will sit and wait for however long it takes to make sure that when they decide to conduct the attack, that they're going to get the money. And it can be very difficult to recover from that. So I wanted to bring it up just because I don't think it gets talked about enough, but it is certainly a common attack. And of course, phishing, spear phishing. I'm sure people are probably really tired of talking about phishing, but we wouldn't be talking about it if it wasn't still an issue. So I think it's another one of those things that, as much as we hate talking about it, it's really important to understand that phishing attacks still happen all the time. They're still super effective. I think the last metrics I saw was something like 60% of cyber attacks, maybe from the last year or the year before, were phishing. And when the COVID pandemic started early 2020, phishing was like through the roof. It was an easy thing for people to do. And highly sophisticated attacks, in the private sector, they're going for big payouts, right? They're looking for the big money. And in the public sector, they're probably looking for information. They really want data, and that's what they're going after. And they could be in the private sector too, right? It's not mutually exclusive, but it's an interesting thing to note that the way that they're targeting different sectors, the phishing attempts are going to look different. Spear phishing is going to be wildly different. And they're going to be looking for different types of data. So I think it's really important to understand, especially from a cybersecurity across domains perspective, that you have to sort of look at specific type of attacks, especially when you're looking at like threat hunting or threat intelligence, to sort of say, hey, how can we get ahead of this? Understanding what type of attacks would be targeting what type of sector. And of course, vulnerability chaining. Of course, it's probably used private sector or public sector. It's just a common method for attackers to use, but it is interesting to see that vulnerability chaining, especially with APT groups, that seems to be very, very common because it is somewhat sophisticated, or can be somewhat sophisticated, which is why, again, I'm going to talk about a little bit, but vulnerability management is so important to identifying and understanding these concepts. All right, so again, I'm not going to read the whole thing here, but I did want to include this information because depending on the type of sector, there are different goals, there are different attack vectors, and ultimately they're going to be doing something different. They may not necessarily want to compromise accounts. In waste and water, they're trying to upset water treatment, but more in the news, we've seen that they're defacing utilities websites. So sometimes it's hacktivists, that are going in, and they really just ultimately want to call out, what they could be upset about something, or frustrated or mad about a way a situation is handled. And so they're just going to change the website and say whatever they want to say, which again can be highly effective, especially when it comes to reputation. Transportation, they want to steal information on shipments. If there's something very specific that's getting shipped, They want to know where it's going. They want to know when it's going to be there, because they want to see if they can either disrupt the shipment or be there and take whatever it is that they're looking for, or looking at PII on the employees or their partners. Third parties, I think it's really important to mention how important third parties are, and vendors and consultants are across these sectors. They're always going to be a target because they probably have similar access as general users would of the company or of the department, but they may have, they may have different types of security, or they may be an easier target, who knows. So it's just an important sort of attack vector to be aware of. Energy. This is, I found this one really, really interesting when I was doing a little bit more research into the energy sector. Specifically, cyber criminals, they're trying to understand what are the economic implications of affecting the energy sector. So if they're going to bring down utilities, what does that mean economically across the world? So they're not just targeting to say, I want to disrupt systems or I want to deface your website. No, I want to understand what are the impacts globally by conducting a cyber attack. So I found that very, very interesting. The IT sector, just everything. DDoS, ransomware, malware. I mean, everything, right? That's sort of why cybersecurity exists, right? Is to sort of help the IT sector. But it's any kind of attack you can think of is they're going for the IT sectors for sure. And then nuclear, of course, I think this is probably the scariest one for all of us. If they're trying to affect operations at a nuclear power plant, I'm pretty concerned. But that's ultimately, a concern or something to be aware of, that there are potentially attackers out there trying to figure out how to do this. And that's certainly, I think, probably one of the scariest sectors, just because of the potential global impacts of that. But when it comes to waste and water, if you think about vulnerability chaining, not from a using low and medium vulnerabilities together, but from a, what if I was to combine attacks to multiple sectors? How impactful would that be? It would be insane. I mean, think about the amount of people that they would have to bring in to bring systems back online, or to, to replace systems, or to, just bring water to people, bringing fresh water to people. How impactful that is across multiple sectors. So I just wanted to bring this up as a, there are different types of ways of targeting different sectors, but ultimately, any combination of these could be pretty severe. All right, so what kind of challenges are being faced in the public sector? And again, there's a lot of really great open source information on this topic specifically. I think the biggest point I want to make here is potentially, legacy systems, right? That's a huge challenge, probably across private and public sector as well. But legacy systems are a big challenge because they can't get patched. You may be able to, put them behind a firewall or have some other mitigating controls, but if there are legacy applications built on legacy systems, and they're responsible for, critical infrastructure, like what if, and I'm saying what if, because I don't know, but what if, waste and water systems are using, legacy software to support our water systems? That's a whole other challenge right there, is trying to figure out how can you replace them and still support all of the functions that people really need. How can you do them both at the same time? Migrating to the cloud, there are certainly a lot of benefits to that, but there are some challenges around that as well. Particularly, having the skill set and the ability to make sure that if there are systems that are going into the cloud, what data is going to live there? Who's managing it? What's your patch management strategy? What's your monitoring strategy? All of those things. So I think, when we talk about cloud, it's sort of like, oh, well, there's a lot of benefits, and there absolutely are. There really, really are. When it's set up properly, it's amazing. But there are definitely some things that have to be thought of before just sort of lifting and shifting environments. And then I bring up this OT. operations technology, that's really critical infrastructure. There's this interesting sort of, especially in a lot of research, talking about IT-OT convergence, where IT and OT are sort of, OT systems are relying on IT systems. What I think is so interesting about that is when I say lack of security knowledge, I mean, that's even someone like for me, right? Because if I'm not working with operations technology all the time and I don't understand it in depth, it's going to be very hard for me to understand and make sure that I understand what security measures need to be put into place, especially when there are specialty applications at play that are, or legacy systems that are managing these critical infrastructure. For the private sector, so emerging technology is moving so incredibly fast. And I mean, across all types of technology, right? A lot of times the technology comes first and then security comes second. And that's a huge challenge and concern, because if we just start moving to using all this new tech, but the security isn't there to back it up or to make sure that it's there in place at first, it's really, really difficult to constantly play catch up. So it's definitely a challenge. Security frameworks, if you're not, very familiar with, like the NIST 853, that's on Rev 5 now. If you're familiar with it from working in the public sector, this type of stuff is pretty easy. Like you sort of understand the framework, you understand how to implement it and sort of go from there. But if you don't have that sort of public sector experience and you're sort of learning about, whether it's CIS benchmarks or NIST or it's a lot to learn. And if you're trying to adhere to a certain framework and you're not sure, it can be increasingly difficult. And if you're constantly doing, audits and assessments, and you're trying to figure out, well, what controls apply to me or what don't, it makes security complex, which makes security, it's cumbersome and then it's difficult to do when people don't want to do it. Vulnerability management challenges. This is one of those things, this is regardless of public sector, private sector. I think this is it's challenging because it's incredibly complex. And as we have all this emerging tech and all of this new way, we're talking about like microservices and micro application development and things like that. It's difficult for vulnerability management practices to keep up. A lot of the research on vulnerability management is somewhat outdated. It's pretty old. And especially with how many new types of technology we're using, new ways of development, I think there's sort of that missing piece of updated vulnerability management frameworks to sort of fix that gap and try to make vulnerability management easy. Okay, so common threats, this is across sectors, right? Like this is just, I mean, besides OT, which is pretty specifically critical infrastructure, but one of the things that I've seen with, and again, a lot of the research that's out there, phishing, it is still easy and effective. There's still a lot of concern there, whether not independent of industry. Ransomware, the same thing. It's easy to create, it's easy to buy, it's easy to use. Unfortunately, that is really an unfortunate thing. Software supply chain attacks. I really only see that getting more complex and very difficult for people to get a handle on, because development has sort of been moving at such a rapid pace and relying a lot on these third-party libraries and on other things, and so it's difficult to get a handle on this. Insider threats, especially for critical infrastructure. I feel like we need to talk about this more, because insider threats don't get talked a lot about. There are certainly some that you hear about, from the public sector, especially if, someone had taken files or something or taken data, and you sort of hear about it on the news, but we don't hear about it as much with critical infrastructure. But oh man, I wish I had the metric with me, but there's a metric out there. I'm going to find the research, but for how many employees take company data with them when they leave a company. And, in the private sector, if somebody's taking company proprietary data, that's a huge concern. Likewise, if someone works at a water and wastewater treatment plant and they're taking data with them, where's that data going? Is it going on their Google Drive? Is it accessible? Is it, where's it going? So, so I think that's an important note. And of course, social engineering. It's another thing that I think people are aware of because of, it's pretty common to talk about insecurity awareness training, but social engineering is still highly effective, and for lots of reasons. Understanding psychological and behavioral traits can be really effective in improving phishing scams and, ransomware as well. Because it's this, hey, we've locked down your systems and you can't get in now and you have to give us money. It's this pay now and we'll give you access and all this other stuff. So social engineering is still highly effective. I wanted to put some of the industries, organizations down here that are super helpful. This is really just sort of a list of references. I'm sure a lot of people are already aware of these, but I did want to bring them up because, NIST has published some great, really recent documentation specifically on the software supply chain, securing the software supply chain. Highly recommend you check that out. The NIST guide is great. The collaboration between DHS, FBI, NSA, it has been amazing. They've put out some really, really great and timely information. A couple of days ago, they posted something about there's this attack going on right now where basically they're ultimately able to disable MFA. If you haven't seen it, I highly suggest you check it out. They post some great mitigations on there as well. MITRE, the attack and complementary defend frameworks, they can be super helpful just to sort of understand what does that attack pathing look like, and then how do I ultimately protect against it. And then the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, CVSS, they have some pretty good guidance on vulnerability scoring if you're interested in learning more. They're a great resource as well. So what can we do about it? There's a lot. There's a lot that we can do about it, and I think by even just talking about it, this is why I love doing presentations, especially about topics like this, because the biggest thing is getting people together and really getting to discuss like what are our challenges and what can we do about it. I think sometimes it's difficult to have like these kind of hard conversations, but it's better for us to talk about it and see what we can do about it. Increase collaboration. I am a huge, big proponent of collaboration between private, public, and academia. I know, especially personally in my own professional, career, learning about research and research methodologies, understanding how to define a problem has been super helpful for me in practical and technical exercises. So I think increased partnership, talking about these challenges between those partnerships and how can they collaborate and ultimately fix them. Building a maturity model. So cybersecurity is complex. And it's only getting more complex the more systems we have, the more applications that are being developed. It's only going to get more complex. So building a maturity model, don't say fix all the vulnerabilities because it's never going to happen, but what can we fix and in what order should we try to work on them? Yeah, I'm sure you guys are surprised I'm going to talk about human factors too, but how does human factors play into this? Are there human factors groups that work in critical infrastructure? I don't know. I haven't heard of any. I hope there are that maybe I'm just not aware of. That would be awesome. Human factors is the integration of engineering, psychological practices, and design. Talking about UX and UI design, but also how do people use the tools that they have? So how is OT being used? Who's using it? How do they understand it? Is the interface appropriate for them? Does it make sense? Does it have security by design? All of those things. So I think human factors could be an interesting area to study and involve in the critical infrastructure sectors. Understanding how attacks differ between sectors. This is where, it's the same thing with vulnerability management. Like, you're never going to fix all the things, and that's okay. But if you can understand what are my highest risks, what do I need to be most concerned with, then you can start to build a map from there and say, okay, these things I know I need to be concerned with over time, or over time, this risk will increase. So I think it's important to sort of create a risk profile, but understand that it should be a living document. It shouldn't be, this is our risk profile today, and this is what we follow. it's going to change over time. I mean, considering geopolitical events and all kinds of other things, right? New technology, new types of cyber attacks. It's so that risk profile has to grow over time. Threat intelligence, that is it's one of those things that I know it's difficult to do for, small to medium-sized businesses or some organizations, but having a threat intelligence or a threat modeling program, integrating that into your cyber programs can be really, really helpful. That helps to collect that information that's pertinent, sector-specific information and things like that. And then, of course, security by design, which I hope we'll get to a place somewhere in the near future, secure by design practices. And again, I have to talk about vulnerability management because I have to. Asset inventory, whether you're talking about IT, OT, doesn't matter. Asset inventory has to be the number one. You have to understand what you have, mobile devices, on-premise, cloud, what do you have? What are you using? Continuous monitoring. This is one of those pieces that I think, people are like, oh, well, we're running scans, constantly, like we're continuous monitoring. It's like, okay, you're running scans. Are you monitoring for differences? If you enabled a GPO one day, did you check it the next day to make sure that it's actually working properly on the system that you apply the GPO to? So continuous monitoring is just that. Risk management. Risk management is really a sort of an umbrella to vulnerability management. Vulnerability management is sort of a component of that, but having a risk management program that helps you to prioritize risk. I think that's the most helpful thing, because we're never going to be able to eliminate risk totally, but having that prioritization. And then configuration management, sometimes it can be really challenging, but there are a lot of things you can do to create a secure baseline and integrate more security over time. So there's a lot of great resources out there for that too. And I think I hit right at the time. So that was my presentation. Thank you guys so much. Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I know I sort of went through the end there really quickly. So if you are looking for any of the resources or references, please let me know. I'm happy to provide that. And then I guess I'll turn it back to Bill. I don't know if we had some questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Robinson. We do have questions. We have comments as well. I'm going to scroll back to some of them because we may have to remind people of what it was that you were talking about at the point. Chris mentioned that in one of your slides, you did not mention the Department of Homeland Security. I think that was an oversight more than anything else on your part, but certainly they play a role. Have you, in your work, have you been intersecting at all with DHS?
So I assume CISA. Yeah, and maybe when the question was asked, I hadn't gotten to that slide yet about talking about DHS and FBI and all that. I am a big fan of what CISA is doing and what they've been putting out. They have some of the most comprehensive, up-to-date information on not just cyber attacks and cyber threats, but how to mitigate them, or at least, or monitor for them, things like that. So, yeah, CISA they're pretty much my number one place I go to for information, for sure.
Thank you. I want to give a shout out here to, now I've lost it. I was going to say, we've got someone who is taking data and it's too many things came in all at once. Forgive me.
Oh, was this for the senior project?
Yes.
Richard Adams.
Okay, I wanted to give him a shout out for the work that he's doing. Okay, I'm using the Colonial Pipeline event and ransomware attacks as a foundation for my senior project. Well, good for you, Richard. Errol says, I would think that the architect design core security policies and infrastructures and engineers primarily work on, while the analyst, he's answering the question, what's the difference between an analyst and architect design? And that was, he does have an answer here, but you might have amplification of that answer.
Yeah, I can go into that a little more. So a security analyst, when we talk about sort of boots on the ground, someone that is looking at, and again, the cybersecurity domains are huge. A security analyst could work in multiple areas. You could have a security analyst that works in threat intelligence, or you could have a security analyst that works in a SOC. that is managing alerts and monitoring alerts, whether that's network alerts, EDR alerts, things like that. But yeah, so a security analyst is more technical, monitoring tools, looking for data, things like that, where a security architect is really looking at the big picture. So like at an enterprise level, what does security look like? So they may be looking at tools, but a security architect would cover a lot of the different domains within cybersecurity. So they would have to have an understanding of a lot of the different sections and domains within cybersecurity, and help to build systems securely and understand what does security mean at the enterprise level.
Thank you. The Vel asks an interesting, I don't know if it's a question or a comment, but I'm going to read it. She said, she or he make the operating system companies financially liable because of flaws in their system that hackers exploit. This will stop the holes. Is that actually something that could happen? I mean, is that a doable or reasonable thing to think about?
I think there will be, again, this is just my personal opinion based on, just sort of my my background. And I would say it is possible that there could be more regulations and laws and things like that. Now, there was in New York, they have the NYDFS or NYFDS. I can't remember what it's called, but it's basically the financial sector security. So they have guidance that says you must meet all of these things. And they had a timeline that they had to reach. It was like 2 years. And some of the things that they had to do was like conduct like semi-annual pen tests. You must have a CISO, you must have this. So there were quite a few things that came out from New York. I don't know about at a federal level, but it is possible that we'll see that at more state levels for sure.
All right. Okay. George asks, how much of the current critical infrastructure is currently in firmware?
Ooh, I don't know. I don't know based on any sort of like public data that's available. I would bet there's probably still a lot, but I don't know.
All right, that would be a difficult one to know. Mandy makes a comment, not all flaws in applications can be forethought and planned out during the SDLC. That's why system administrators need to continue to patch the systems as time goes on, as vulnerabilities get discovered. It's not all the software's fault. I think that would be a common problem, would it not be, that developers cannot anticipate every attack that could be placed upon that system?
No, absolutely not. And this is why I think it's so important to have open communication between developers and security groups, right? It should be a partnership. I would never expect a developer to know every single security setting or thing that they should do. But what I would expect is that they would have a security partner, someone that could come in and say, hey, here's how you can do this securely, or here are 3 ways you could potentially do this securely, right? Not just you must do this, but hey, here are some considerations for you for how you can enact security for this feature or for this area. So yeah, so I would agree. It's more about I think communication and collaboration between the teams, which is why I think the human factors component is so important, of just bringing people together and considering that human aspect, right? Like we can't expect everyone to know everything, but teamwork and a partnership is definitely helpful in that area.
Thank you. Dr. Sinai weighed in here talking about, and I'd like to just mention a little bit, Dr. Joshua Sinai is on our faculty and is an international expert on counterterrorism and directs our programs in those areas. And he mentions that insider threat, organizational insider threat is a continuing education course that's being developed for security personnel. So if you want more information about that, he lists his email, jbsinai@captechu.edu. Also, Chris, thank you for listing the cost of insider threat global report there. George asked this question. I'm not sure I understand it, George, so you may have to clarify it. Maybe Dr. Robinson understands. Is there a version of human factors study for artificial intelligence since it is trained by humans? I'm not sure I completely understand that question, but perhaps you do.
Yeah, so I think the question, and I could be getting it wrong, so please feel free to, rephrase in case I'm not answering this properly, but the short answer is yes, there should be. I don't know if there is right now, but there should be, because so this is why I was so interested in studying human factors, because traditionally human factors is mostly design, designing tools and physical tools like hammers and things like that, as well as, software. So I think it's absolutely applicable to AI and should be studied, because we are developing it as humans. And I think if we don't understand how we would potentially use AI, then there's definitely, I think we've already seen it in the news, right? There's some ways that if AI is not trained properly, it can have some pretty devastating effects. So yes, absolutely.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Kim said, what would you say is something the private sector has overcome in terms of cyber that could be used and applied in the public sector?
Thank you for that question, Kim. So it's a very tough question to answer, mostly because a lot of the, let's say for attacks, for example, can be, a lot of that stuff is probably not going to be disclosed or talked about in any kind of detail. But what I would say is that the increased use of cloud, which we're seeing in the public sector too, but I think the private sector got there first. They probably have a lot of lessons learned in developing and creating applications specifically in the cloud. I think that's probably from a secure perspective, that there could be something to learn there in the public sector. Although I will say there's quite a bit of really good development going on within DoD, with like Kessel Run, and there's a bunch of really good software factories within DoD, and they're doing things pretty quickly and pretty securely. So I would say there's probably lessons to be learned on both sides.
Okay, I'm going to throw out one more question, and then we need to move on. Devel asks, what is the NIST doc on disabling MFA?
Oh, yes. So if you go to the NIST website, it's one of their latest, if you go to the CISA website and go to their latest updates, I think it's Ukraine something. It's the document that they've been updating since everything that's been going on with Ukraine. They have the latest information on that MFA doc as well. Thank you, Prabhakar. I see you put it in the chat.
Okay, thank you very much. We are now needing, I'm going to ask Dr. Robinson to stop screen sharing, and then I will resume screen sharing. And by the way, her references are here. I'll put those up. And we will be furnishing a copy of these slides to you, so you'll have these references as well. We're nearly done. I just want to wrap up a few things. I want to invite you to the upcoming webinars. We change gears now. We've had 3 webinars in a row dealing with some aspect or related to cyber, and now we move into a very different type of series. We have 2 series that really are designed to help you in your career. One is learning how to communicate effectively in a resume and getting that tech career information properly placed on a resume so that it resonates with someone who's trying to hire you. That's in April. In May, a very successful career coach will talk about finding tips for finding career success in technology. And then we switch gears one more time for June, when Dr. Reitzman will talk about flight test engineering. And the picture shows a drone in this particular case, but actually Dr. Reitzman does all kinds of flight testing, including manned flight. So I think you'll enjoy that. It's a very different departure from what we've been discussing, but should be fascinating. Now, to learn more about any of those sessions or to register, just go to captechu.edu webinar-series. They'll list them all there. And by the way, on that same website, you'll find all of the webinars that are on demand. Now, we will be sending a copy of the slides, and a link to the recording will be sent to all registrants, and everybody who's on the session today will get that email. In that email, I will invite you to request a certificate of completion if you want one. We offer a certificate for each of these webinar sessions. You simply need to do that in reply to the email, and the email will have instructions on that. With that, that concludes today's webinar. It has been recorded, and I want to thank Dr. Robinson again for joining us. It's been a fascinating look at an area that we're all vitally concerned about. There's not a single one of us in the audience who is not essentially impacted by these sectors every day, every single day in every way. Even the disruption of a single one of the 16 sectors would have catastrophic events resonating throughout the entire country and perhaps the world. But that concludes the webinar. Look for this email. I want to thank you again for joining us. We are now officially done, and you may log off at any time. So thank you for joining us, and you have a great afternoon.